As the games continued through the afternoon, the chief noticed something remarkable. Every time a new family walked up, looking uncertain about joining in, the kids would immediately wave them over. They'd learned from experience that inclusion was the best response to uncertainty. Mrs. Reed had become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the weekly gatherings. She'd gone from calling the police about suspicious teenagers to becoming their biggest cheerleader. The change in her had inspired others in the neighborhood to examine their own biases and preconceptions. The sun was setting on another successful community day when the chief gathered everyone for an announcement. Next weekend, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, we're having our first official neighborhood basketball league tournament. Everyone's invited. The cheers that erupted weren't just for basketball. They were for community, for growth, for change. Parents hugged their kids, neighbors chatted about forming teams, and Mrs. Reed wiped happy tears from her eyes. As families began packing up for the day, the chief overheard one of the kids asking Mrs. Reed if she'd bring her special cookies to the tournament. Her face lit up as she promised to bake extra batches for everyone. Walking back to his house, the chief paused to look at the scene one last time. The basketball hoop that had once been the center of controversy now stood as a symbol of transformation. What could have torn the neighborhood apart had instead brought it together, stronger than ever. His wife joined him, slipping her hand into his. Who would have thought, she said softly, that a basketball hoop could change so many lives? As the last rays of sunlight faded, the sound of children's laughter still echoed through the street. The neighborhood had learned its lesson well. That community isn't about keeping people out, but about welcoming them in, one basketball game at a time. 1 month later, the neighborhood had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The police chief stood in his driveway early on a Saturday morning, sipping his coffee and watching as his kids set up for what had become a weekly community basketball tournament. What started as a simple game in their driveway had grown into something much bigger. Families from all over the neighborhood, and even from surrounding areas, now gathered every weekend to watch their children play. The driveway wasn't big enough anymore, so the city parks department had helped set up temporary courts in the cul-de-sac. We need more chairs. His wife called from the garage, where she was organizing refreshments with other parents. The sense of community had grown stronger with each passing weekend. Parents brought snacks to share, set up water stations, and even organized a rotation for cleaning up afterward. The chief smiled as he watched Mrs. Reed slowly walk toward the gathering. She looked different now, less rigid, more open. The community program had changed her in unexpected ways. It started with her simply attending as required, sitting quietly at the back during meetings. But gradually, she began to participate, to listen, to understand. Today, she carried a large container of homemade cookies, her own small gesture of change. The kids, naturally forgiving as children often are, had started greeting her with waves and smiles. She'd learned all their names, and more importantly, she'd learned their stories. Those looked delicious, the chief's wife said warmly as Mrs. Reed approached the refreshment table. Would you mind helping me set up? We're expecting a big turnout today. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward moments, tense silences, and hesitant interactions. But with each passing week, the walls of prejudice had crumbled a little more, replaced by understanding and community. As more families arrived, the street came alive with activity. Someone had brought a speaker, playing upbeat music that mixed with the sound of bouncing basketballs and children's laughter. Parents set up lawn chairs along the sidewalk, creating an impromptu audience area. The chief's twins were organizing teams, making sure everyone got a chance to play. They'd become natural leaders, turning their love for basketball into a way to bring people together. Other kids looked up to them, not because of who their father was, but because of how they made everyone feel welcome. Mrs. Reed, who once called the police on these same children, now stood cheering from the sidelines. She'd learned every player's favorite snack, keeping special treats for each team. The children had started calling her Grandma Reed, a nickname that brought tears to her eyes the first time she heard it. A local news crew had even shown up to cover the story. Not the story of prejudice and police calls, but the story of how a neighborhood had transformed itself through basketball and understanding. The reporter interviewed kids and parents, capturing the spirit of community that had emerged from conflict. This is more than just basketball, the chief told the reporter, watching as children from different backgrounds high-fived and hugged after a good play. This is what community looks like when we choose to grow together instead of apart. The city council had taken notice too. They'd approved funding for a permanent community basketball court in the nearby park, inspired by how this neighborhood had turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth. Your actions hurt real people, the chief continued. Not abstract threats to property values, but children. My children. Their friends. Kids who just wanted to play basketball and make friends. He stood up, straightening his uniform. The choice is yours, Mrs. Reed. But remember, this neighborhood is changing because it's growing, becoming more inclusive, more vibrant. You can be part of that growth, or you can fight it. But fighting it only hurts you in the end. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Reed spoke up, her voice small but clear. I'll do the program, she said. I want to understand. The chief nodded, neither celebrating nor condemning. Good. The community relations team will be in touch with details. And Mrs. Reed? Those kids will still be playing basketball in that driveway. They have every right to be there. As they walked back to their cars, the sound of a basketball bouncing could be heard from the chief's driveway. The kids were back, refusing to let fear win. The chief smiled, knowing that sometimes the best response to prejudice was simply to keep playing, keep living, keep showing up. The neighborhood would never be quite the same after this, but maybe, just maybe, it would be better. Change was coming, one basketball game at a time, and even Mrs. Reed was finally starting to understand that she could either grow with it or be left behind. The following Monday morning dawned with a different atmosphere in the neighborhood. Word had spread quickly about Saturday's events, and as people left for work and school, curious glances were cast between Mrs. Reed's house and the police chief's home. The chief had spent Sunday evening preparing for what he knew would be a crucial conversation. As he adjusted his uniform in the mirror that Monday morning, his wife squeezed his shoulder supportively. You've handled tougher situations, she reminded him. By mid-morning, he stood at Mrs. Reed's front door, accompanied by 2 senior officers from the Community Relations Department. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about addressing the deeper issues that had led to it. Mrs. Reed opened the door cautiously, looking considerably different from the confident woman who'd been making recordings just days before. The chief noticed how she'd aged overnight, the weight of her actions visible in the new lines on her face. Good morning, Mrs. Reed, he began professionally. We need to have a conversation about recent events and their consequences. May we come in? His tone was neither angry nor accusatory, just firmly professional. Inside her immaculate living room, surrounded by photos of her own family, Mrs. Reed sat stiffly in her armchair while the officers took seats on her floral couch. The chief remained standing, his presence commanding but not threatening. Mrs. Reed, he started, I'm here wearing 2 hats today, as your police chief and as a father. What happened on Saturday wasn't just about a false police report. It was about weeks of harassment directed at children who were simply living their lives. He gestured to her phone, still sitting on the coffee table. Those recordings you made? They don't show what you think they show. They show children playing basketball. They show friendship forming across racial lines. They show exactly what a healthy neighborhood should look like. Mrs. Reed's hands twisted in her lap. I was just trying to protect property values, she whispered, but even she seemed to hear how hollow those words sounded. Let's be honest, the chief replied calmly. This wasn't about property values or noise. This was about something else entirely, wasn't it? His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. Tears began to form in Mrs. Reed's eyes. I've lived here for so long, she said quietly. Everything's changing so fast. I didn't know how to handle it. The chief nodded, understanding but not excusing. Change isn't always easy, Mrs. Reed. But targeting children, making them feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood, that's never the answer. He pulled out some papers from his briefcase. These are the official complaints being filed regarding your actions. False police report, harassment, unauthorized surveillance of minors. These are serious charges. Mrs. Reed's face paled as she looked at the documents. The community relations officers began explaining the legal process she would face, their voices professional but firm. However, the chief continued, I believe in community solutions when possible. That's why I'm here personally. We're willing to consider alternative resolutions if you're willing to do the work. He laid out a proposal. Mrs. Reed would need to attend community sensitivity training, participate in neighborhood integration programs, and most importantly, work with a community liaison to understand the impact of her actions. You have a choice, he explained. We can proceed with full legal charges, or you can take this opportunity to learn and grow, to be part of the change instead of fighting against it. Mrs. Reed looked at the photos on her wall, her own children, now grown, and moved away. What would the community program involve? She asked hesitantly. The chief gestured to one of the community relations officers, who opened a folder. You'd work with our community center. They run programs bringing together people from all parts of our city. You'd hear their stories, share meals, maybe even learn why a simple game of basketball can mean so much to a community. As they laid out the details, something seemed to shift in Mrs. Reed's expression. The fear and anger that had driven her actions began to crack, showing glimpses of something else, perhaps understanding, perhaps regret. The officers began the formal process of taking Mrs. Reed's statement. Her hands shook as she signed the paperwork acknowledging her false report. The consequences of her actions would be handled through proper channels, ensuring both justice and accountability. As the sun began to set on the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the now quiet driveway, a new understanding seemed to settle over the street. The basketball hoop stood as a silent witness to both the worst and best of human nature, prejudice and justice, fear and courage, hate and hope. The twins' mother gathered the children closer. How about we order pizza for everyone? She suggested, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. It was her way of showing that this incident wouldn't change their open, welcoming approach to life. The chief turned to his officers, who were finishing their paperwork. "Thank you for your professionalism," he said quietly. They nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation they'd just handled, one where their chief was both the authority figure and a father protecting his children. As Mrs. Reed was escorted back to her house to await further legal proceedings, the sound of children's laughter began to return to the driveway. The basketball bounced again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. It was more than just a game now, it was a statement about resilience, about refusing to let fear and prejudice win. The responding officers maintained their professional composure, though the situation was unlike anything they'd expected when they received the call. The older officer, a 15-year veteran of the force, took the lead while his partner began taking detailed notes of the scene. "Ma'am," the veteran officer addressed Mrs. Reed, "can you explain why you felt it necessary to call emergency services?" His tone was neutral, but his eyes flickered between the basketball-holding kids and Mrs. Reed's phone, still clutched tightly in her trembling hand. The twins' father stood quietly nearby, his presence as both police chief and parent adding weight to every word exchanged. He'd purposely positioned himself where both his children and Mrs. Reed could see him, offering silent reassurance to the former and a reminder of accountability to the latter. I was concerned about neighborhood safety," Mrs. Reed stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. "There have been large gatherings and the noise." Her voice trailed off as she realized how hollow her complaints sounded in the presence of actual law enforcement. The younger officer spoke up, his notebook open. "According to dispatch, you reported suspicious teenagers and claimed to feel unsafe in your home. Could you elaborate on what made these children playing basketball in their own driveway seem suspicious to you?" Mrs. Reed's face flushed as she looked around, suddenly aware of the neighbors watching from their yards and porches. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, an ironic twist given her own weeks of surveillance. "I have evidence," she declared, holding up her phone. "Weeks of recordings. They're always out here playing, making noise, bringing other children into the neighborhood." She stopped abruptly, realizing each word was only making her position worse. The veteran officer maintained his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, are you aware that using emergency services to report children playing legally on their own property could be considered a false report? Additionally, your admission to weeks of recording minors without parental consent raises serious concerns." The twins' mother had gathered all the kids on their porch, providing them with juice boxes and snacks. She wanted them to see how proper authority handled situations like this, not with anger or revenge, but with calm professionalism and justice. "I'd like to see these recordings," The chief finally spoke, his voice steady. Every single one. Because what you've actually documented is weeks of harassment of my children and their friends. As both a parent and the chief of police, I find that deeply concerning. Mrs. Reed's hand holding the phone dropped to her side. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She had called the police on the police chief's children. More than that, she had spent weeks building a case against innocent kids whose only crime was playing basketball while being different from her. The younger officer continued taking statements from neighbors who stepped forward voluntarily. They described Mrs. Reed's escalating behavior over the past weeks, the constant surveillance, the hostile comments, the attempts to rally other neighbors against the family. Each of these incidents will need to be documented, the veteran officer explained. False reporting of a crime is a serious offense, Mrs. Reed. So is harassment, especially when minors are involved. His words carried the weight of years of experience dealing with similar situations. The twins' father stepped closer to Mrs. Reed, his demeanor professional but firm. "We're going to handle this officially," he said. "Not as neighbors, not as individuals, but through proper legal channels. You've left us no choice." Some of the watching neighbors nodded in approval. Others looked away, perhaps recognizing times they'd stayed silent when they should have spoken up against similar behavior in the past. The kids on the porch watched everything with wide eyes. They were seeing firsthand how justice could work when handled properly, not with shouting or threats, but with calm, professional action backed by law and evidence. "I want all the children who've been playing basketball here to know something," the chief said, raising his voice slightly so all could hear. "You have done nothing wrong. You have every right to play, to laugh, to enjoy your weekends with your friends. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Mrs. Reed's phone hand dropped to her side, her face draining of color. The suspicious teenagers, she reported, were not only innocent kids playing basketball. They were the police chief's children and their friends. Her weeks of surveillance, her exaggerated complaints, her false report. Everything was suddenly being seen in a very different light. The kids watched from the driveway as their father handled the situation with remarkable composure. He dealt with similar incidents throughout his career, but this time it was personal. This time, it was his own children being treated as suspicious for simply existing in their own space. The other neighbors, who'd been watching the scene unfold, began stepping out onto their porches. They'd seen Mrs. Reed's behavior over the past weeks, had witnessed her escalating harassment of these children. Now they stood as silent witnesses to the consequences of her actions. The officers who'd responded to the call were taking notes now, but not about the children playing basketball. Instead, they were documenting Mrs. Reed's false report, her admission of weeks of surveillance, and her deliberate omission of crucial facts when calling 911. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as justice prepared to take an unexpected turn. Mrs. Reed's attempt to intimidate a family had backfired in a way she never could have anticipated, and the neighborhood was about to learn an important lesson about prejudice, power, and the consequences of misusing emergency services. The next weekend arrived with a kind of perfect afternoon that usually brought peace to the neighborhood. The twins had just finished their homework and were eager to get outside for their now regular basketball game. Their cousins had called earlier, excited to come over again despite last weekend's uncomfortable situation. As the kids started their game, the gentle thump of the basketball against concrete echoed through the street. Some of the neighborhood kids who'd become regular players began showing up, their parents waving friendly hellos as they dropped them off. The scene was a picture of suburban harmony, children laughing, playing, and enjoying their weekend. Mrs. Reed had been unusually quiet all morning, which the twins' mother noted with concern. Experience had taught her that this kind of silence often preceded something worse. She wasn't wrong. Around 3 p.m., as the game was in full swing with about 8 kids playing and taking turns, Mrs. Reed appeared on her porch with her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, there's a large group of suspicious teenagers gathering," she was saying, her voice deliberately loud enough to carry across the yards. "They've been causing disturbances every weekend. I'm concerned about property values and neighborhood safety." The twins' mother, who was arranging snacks on their porch table, felt her heart sink. She knew exactly what was happening. Mrs. Reed was calling the police. She'd seen this scenario play out before, knew how these situations could escalate dangerously if not handled properly. I don't feel safe in my own home, Mrs. Reed continued, pacing her porch. They're being very aggressive with that ball. Yes, I've tried asking them to stop, but they won't listen. There must be at least 10 of them now. The kids had noticed Mrs. Reed's phone call too. The older ones, understanding what was happening, exchanged worried glances. The basketball's bounce slowed, then stopped completely. The younger children picked up on the tension, moving closer together instinctively. "Mom?" One of the twins called out, voice uncertain. "Should we stop playing?" Their mother stood straight, keeping her voice calm but firm. "No, sweetheart. You're not doing anything wrong. Keep playing your game." But she pulled out her own phone, quickly texting her husband about the situation. As the city's police chief, he needed to know what was happening. Mrs. Reed was now providing detailed descriptions of the children to the 911 dispatcher, carefully omitting the fact that these were the neighbor kids she'd been watching for weeks. She described them as suspicious characters and possible troublemakers, using coded language that carried heavy implications. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had been a joyful Saturday afternoon now felt tense and uncertain. Some of the kids suggested going home, but the twins' mother encouraged them to stay. "We can't let fear stop us from living our lives," she said, though she kept a careful eye on Mrs. Reed. About 10 minutes later, the first police car turned onto their street, moving slowly with its lights off. Mrs. Reed practically ran to the curb, waving her arms to flag them down. The kids froze in place, the basketball forgotten in mid-dribble. 2 officers stepped out of their car, and immediately their body language changed as they recognized the house and the situation. These were their chief's kids and their friends, playing basketball in their own driveway. They'd been briefed about the new chief's address and family, and they quickly understood what kind of call this really was. Mrs. Reed hurried toward them, clutching her phone with its evidence of weeks of recordings. Finally, "I've been documenting everything," she started, but the officer's attention was already shifting to the group of clearly harmless children standing in the driveway. "Ma'am," one officer said carefully, "are you aware that this is the residence of?" Before he could finish his sentence, another car pulled up, an unmarked police vehicle. The twins' father stepped out, still in his chief's uniform from his weekend shift. The look on Mrs. Reed's face was a mixture of shock and dawning horror as realization set in. He walked calmly toward the scene, nodding to his officers. "I got a message about a disturbance call at my address," he said, his voice professional and controlled. "Would someone like to explain what's going on?" The afternoon continued with this strange tension, children playing and laughing, adults chatting and enjoying the weather, neighbors dropping by with friendly gestures of support, all while Mrs. Reed conducted her one-woman surveillance operation from the edges of her property. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway, the kids showed no signs of wanting to wrap up their game. They'd found their rhythm again, refusing to let Mrs. Reed's behavior rob them of their fun. Their laughter and game-calling floated through the air, a testimony to children's resilience in the face of adult prejudice. But everyone present could feel it. This wasn't over. Mrs. Reed's agitation was building with each passing hour, with each new child who joined the game, with each neighbor who stopped by to show support for the family. She was a pot slowly coming to boil, and everyone could sense that soon, very soon, she would do something that would change everything. The twins' father kept one eye on the game and one on Mrs. Reed, recognizing the signs of someone about to cross a line. He'd seen it countless times in his years on the force, that moment when someone's prejudice overwhelms their judgment. He knew that the next time the kids gathered to play, Mrs. Reed wouldn't be content with just recording videos and making threats. The question wasn't if she would escalate the situation, but when, and how far she would go to try to force this family to conform to her twisted version of neighborhood standards. The weekend arrived with a kind of perfect weather that practically begged for outdoor activities. The twins had been looking forward to their cousins visiting all week, and the excitement in their house was contagious. Their mother was in the kitchen preparing snacks while their father set up a new water cooler by the driveway, anticipating an afternoon of active play. Around noon, 2 cars pulled up and out tumbled their cousins, 4 kids ranging from 10 to 14 years old. The sound of their happy greetings and laughter filled the previously quiet street. Their aunt and uncle stepped out too, carrying folding chairs and a cooler of drinks, ready to make an afternoon of it. "Look at this driveway," one of the cousins exclaimed. "It's perfect for basketball." The kids immediately started organizing themselves into teams, the ball bouncing rhythmically against the concrete as they warmed up. Some neighborhood kids who'd played with the twins during the week began drifting over, drawn by the infectious energy of the gathering. Mrs. Reed's curtains twitched almost immediately. She'd been on high alert since the new family moved in, but the sight of more children gathering sent her into a frenzy of activity. She emerged from her house with her phone already in hand, making no attempt to hide her recording this time. The family gathering was everything you'd expect on a beautiful weekend afternoon. Kids playing basketball, adults chatting and laughing, the occasional cheer when someone made a particularly good shot. The other neighbors who passed by smiled at the scene, some even stopping to watch the game for a few minutes. But Mrs. Reed saw something entirely different. She paced along her property line, muttering about proper neighborhood conduct and maintaining standards. Her phone was raised like a weapon, documenting every laugh, every bounce of the ball, every moment of joy as if it were evidence of some terrible crime. "Excuse me," she finally called out, her voice sharp enough to make several kids pause mid-game. "This is a quiet neighborhood. This kind of gathering isn't appropriate." The word gathering came out of her mouth like it was something dirty, something dangerous. The twins' uncle, still holding his water bottle from the sidelines, stepped forward with a friendly smile. "The kids are just playing basketball, ma'am. Would you like to join us? We've got plenty of snacks to share." His genuine offer of friendship seemed to infuriate Mrs. Reed even more. "I'm documenting everything," she announced, waving her phone. "Every single disturbance. Every single violation of neighborhood peace." Her voice was getting louder with each word, creating the very disturbance she was supposedly concerned about. The twins' mother exchanged glances with their aunt. They'd both seen this type of behavior before, knew exactly what was really bothering Mrs. Reed. And it had nothing to do with noise or neighborhood standards. The kids had stopped playing now, the basketball held still in confused hands as they watched the scene unfold. "Maybe we should go inside," one of the younger cousins suggested quietly, but the twins' father shook his head. "No," he said firmly but calmly. "You kids keep playing. You're not doing anything wrong." He made sure his voice carried clearly across the driveway, loud enough for Mrs. Reed to hear. The kids hesitantly resumed their game, though their earlier carefree joy had been dampened. Mrs. Reed's next move was to walk up and down the sidewalk, narrating into her phone as if she were documenting a crime scene. Saturday, 2:15 p.m., large gathering of teenagers engaging in disruptive behavior. Excessive noise. Potential property damage risks. Declining neighborhood standards. Other neighbors began emerging from their homes, not to complain about the basketball game, but to show their support for the family. One brought over a plate of cookies. Another rolled out their portable speaker, asking if the kids would like some music to play by. It was a quiet but powerful message to Mrs. Reed. She didn't speak for the neighborhood. But Mrs. Reed was too focused on her self-appointed mission to notice she was becoming increasingly isolated in her behavior. She continued her documentation, now adding commentary about outside elements and neighborhood character, words that carried obvious undertones of prejudice. The twins' father watched all this while helping the kids practice their free throws. As both a parent and a police chief, he recognized the delicate balance required in this situation. He needed to protect his children's right to enjoy their home while also preventing any escalation that could make things worse. But Mrs. Reed saw each new child as another reason to be concerned. She began making calls to other neighbors, trying to rally support for her cause. Most dismissed her worries, some outright told her she was being ridiculous, but she remained undeterred. The twins' mother watched this all unfold from inside, her worry growing with each passing hour. She'd seen this pattern before, how innocent situations could escalate when someone like Mrs. Reed decided to make them into problems. She called her husband at work, giving him a heads up about their watchful neighbor. "Just document everything," he advised, his voice tired but determined. "If she crosses any lines, we'll handle it properly." His years in law enforcement had taught him that sometimes the best response to prejudice was calm, professional documentation. As the sun began to set and the kids started heading home, Mrs. Reed finally retreated inside her house, but not before taking one last video of the evidence, children saying goodbye, picking up their water bottles and helping to clean up any stray wrappers from their snacks. The twins' mother called them in for dinner, watching as they collected their basketball and water bottles. Despite Mrs. Reed's attempts to make them feel unwelcome, the kids had managed to have a wonderful day. They'd made new friends, improved their game, and started to feel at home in their new neighborhood. But as she closed the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Mrs. Reed's behavior was a warning sign she'd seen too many times before, the calm before a storm of prejudice dressed up as concern for the neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring another day of basketball, friendship, and joy for the children, but it would also bring more unwanted attention from their self-appointed neighborhood monitor. The morning sun had barely risen when Mrs. Reed stepped out onto her front porch, coffee cup in hand, her sharp eyes immediately drawn to the activity at the new neighbor's house. She'd lived on Oak Ridge Avenue for 23 years, and she prided herself on knowing everything that happened on her street. The arrival of the new police chief and his family had disrupted her carefully monitored routine. From behind her carefully manicured bushes, she watched as the twins headed out to their driveway, basketball in hand. The steady rhythm of the ball bouncing against concrete seemed to irritate her more than the garbage trucks that usually woke her up. She took another sip of her coffee, her lips pursed in disapproval. "They're going to damage someone's car with that ball," she muttered to herself, though the twins were being perfectly careful. She'd already started keeping a notebook of what she called incidents, harmless activities that she somehow transformed into neighborhood threats in her mind. Throughout the morning, Mrs. Reed found reasons to step outside repeatedly. She watered her already damp flowers, checked her mail 6 times, and rearranged her porch furniture, all while keeping her attention fixed on the new family's house. When the twins' mother came out to give them water bottles, Mrs. Reed quickly ducked behind her newspaper, though her eyes never left the scene. By afternoon, a few other neighborhood kids had gathered in the driveway. The sounds of children laughing and playing filled the air, normal weekend sounds that brought smiles to most neighbors' faces. But Mrs. Reed saw something different. She saw what she wanted to see, a threat to her precious neighborhood's character. She began taking photos with her phone, trying to be subtle but failing miserably. When one of the kids waved at her, she quickly pretended to be photographing her prized roses instead. Her camera roll was filling up with images that showed nothing more than children enjoying a game of basketball, though in her mind, she was gathering evidence. The police chief's wife noticed the strange behavior from their kitchen window. As she prepared lunch for the kids, she watched Mrs. Reed pace her front yard, phone in hand. She'd dealt with people like this before, people who saw threats where there were none, who turned innocent moments into imagined crimes. "Come in for lunch, kids," she called out, wanting to give them a break from the uncomfortable surveillance. As the children filed inside, Mrs. Reed practically pressed herself against her living room window, counting how many kids entered the house, as if this information was somehow crucial to neighborhood security. During lunch, the twins told their mother about the weird lady who kept watching them. "She makes me feel like I'm doing something wrong," one of them said, pushing their sandwich around the plate. "But we're just playing basketball." Their mother's heart ached at these words. They dealt with this kind of subtle harassment before, but she'd hoped things would be different here, especially given her husband's new position. She reminded them that they had every right to play in their own driveway and that they shouldn't let anyone make them feel unwelcome in their own home. After lunch, when the kids returned to their game, Mrs. Reed was ready with her phone again. This time, she'd progressed to taking videos, muttering about documenting disturbances as she paced along her property line. The other neighbors began to notice her bizarre behavior, exchanging concerned glances and disapproving headshakes. One elderly neighbor, who'd lived there even longer than Mrs. Reed, finally walked over to her. "Those children aren't doing anything wrong," she said firmly. "They're just playing basketball on a beautiful day." Mrs. Reed merely sniffed in response, clutching her phone tighter. As the afternoon wore on, more neighborhood kids joined the game. The driveway became a place of joy and friendship, with children from different backgrounds coming together over their shared love of basketball. It was exactly the kind of community building that most people would celebrate. The chief stood up and walked to the window, watching as the last hints of daylight faded from the sky. In the reflection of the glass, he could see his family behind him, his wife now helping the twins unpack their prized possessions, all of them laughing at some shared joke. This was everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of providing for his family. 2 decades of service had taught him that change doesn't come easy, that progress often meets resistance. But standing there in his new home, surrounded by the love of his family and the promise of tomorrow, he felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did he know, those challenges would arrive sooner than he expected, and from a direction he least anticipated. As the family prepared for their first night in their new home, the twins finally exhausted from the day's excitement, their father took one last walk through the house. Each room held the potential for new memories, each space a blank canvas for their family's future. Tomorrow would bring the task of settling in, of making this house truly their home. But for tonight, they had already accomplished something remarkable. They had taken their place in a community that was about to learn some important lessons about judgment, justice, and the power of breaking down barriers. The summer breeze carried the sound of moving trucks down Oak Ridge Avenue, where a 2-story brick house was about to welcome its new owners. The recently appointed police chief and his family were finally moving into their dream home after years of hard work and dedication to the community. As the movers carefully unloaded furniture from the truck, the chief's 12-year-old twins could barely contain their excitement. They darted from room to room, their footsteps echoing through the empty house as they called dibs on bedrooms and explored every corner of their new territory. "Look at this backyard," one twin exclaimed, pressing their face against the sliding glass door. "We can definitely fit a basketball court here." The other twin was already mapping out where they'd put the hoop, their eyes sparkling with possibilities. Their father watched from the kitchen, a proud smile playing on his face. After 20 years on the force, working his way up from patrol officer to detective and now to chief, he'd finally achieved both his professional dreams and his personal goal of providing his family with a home in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. His wife stood beside him, squeezing his hand. "You did it," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did it," he corrected her, pulling her close. They both knew this move represented more than just a change of address. It was a symbol of progress, not just for their family, but for the entire community. Being the first black police chief in the city's history meant carrying both a heavy responsibility and a burning hope for positive change. The afternoon unfolded like a scene from a perfect moving day. Neighbors from the houses on either side stopped by with welcome baskets. One brought homemade cookies, the other a practical collection of local takeout menus and household supplies. The warmth of their welcome made the family feel like they'd made the right choice. As the sun began to set, the twins were already testing out the smooth driveway with their basketball. The gentle thump of the ball against concrete mixed with their laughter, creating a soundtrack of pure joy. Their father joined them for a quick game, still in his moving clothes, teaching them a new dribbling technique as several kids from nearby houses watched curiously from their yards. Inside, their mother was unpacking boxes in the kitchen, arranging their familiar items in their new space, making it feel more like home with each plate and cup she placed in the cabinets. Family photos found their places on walls and shelves, snapshots of birthdays, graduations, and precious moments that told their story. The chief's phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from his colleagues at the police department, each one expressing their excitement about working under his leadership. He'd earned their respect through years of dedicated service, and his appointment had been met with widespread approval from both the force and the community. As night fell, the family gathered in their partially furnished living room, sitting on boxes and folding chairs, sharing pizza straight from the box. The twins couldn't stop talking about their plans for their new rooms, while their parents exchanged knowing glances, silently celebrating this milestone. "Tomorrow, we'll put up the basketball hoop," their father promised, causing the twins to high-five each other enthusiastically. "And this weekend, maybe we can invite your cousins over for the first official game on the new court." Looking out the window at their new neighborhood, with its well-maintained lawns and peaceful streets, none of them could have predicted the storm that was brewing just a few houses down. For now, they were simply a family embarking on a new chapter, their hearts full of hope and excitement for the future.